Suella Braverman has been sacked this morning as Home Secretary and asked to leave the government completely. And Rishi Sunak has used this to kind of kick off a major cabinet reshuffle. James Cleverly, who was Foreign Secretary, is replacing her at the Home Office. And probably the most curveball announcement so far, and I need to tell our listeners we are recording as this is happening, so a lot will be happening in the course of the day. David Cameron is returning. He's been put in the Lords so that he can be Foreign Secretary.
And that is the former Prime Minister.
Yes, that is the former Prime Minister, if you don't remember.
Who came in
a
2019.
new up-and-coming rising star in the Conservative Party. Let's see if we can figure all of this out. And I do have to emphasise it is breaking as we're recording. Should we start off by talking about Suella Braverman's sacking? So why is she gone?
Well, I mean, rumours have been going around Westminster for days now that we're going to have this big reshuffle. I think the key thing is that all of her comments, all of her forays into the media has been an absolute distraction over the whole of the autumn. I remember this was the autumn that the government's supposed to reset their political narrative. You've got Suella Braverman sounding off at the same time that we've got the King's speech about homelessness being a lifestyle, when it wasn't really official government policy. And then we've had the same thing with the protest this weekend. She came out and said they were hate marches, which attracted a lot of criticism, whatever you think about that. And it continued through the weekend. So I think for Number 10, it was getting to the point where she was both undermining Rishi Sunak's authority and distracting from their broader political mission.
And she's been a loose cannon for a while. I remember speaking to people who work closely with her during the Conservative Party conference last year when she was making her kind of freelance comments about Britain having a benefit street culture and her dream being a Rwanda plane taking off on the front page of the Telegraph. And, even then she was causing some worries within the party about the way that she was just saying what she liked. And then, of course, earlier this year, we had her speech to the think tank in Washington talking about how multiculturalism has failed. And that's something that Rishi Sunak has actually disputed. So there was clearly a difference between at least the tone in which the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary talked.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things because is there that much difference between her policy on the boats and Rishi Sunak's? I'm not sure there is. And it's one of the reasons that I don't think necessarily she'll be able to mount a massive rebellion from the backbenches. Yeah. If Rishi Sunak can basically have the same policy that she's advocating, then I think he can subdue some of that. But the big question is when we have the Supreme Court ruling on Wednesday, it's expected on Wednesday, on the Rwanda scheme, that will completely change the dynamic. And I think that's the context in which we have to see the reshuffle. If the Supreme Court does strike down the Rwanda policy, then you're going to have calls within the party for the UK to leave the European Court on Human Rights. So that's another lightning rod, another focus for the right-wingers within the party to coalesce around, and Suella Braverman could be at the front of that charge.
Yeah, and so why did he leave it to sort of the Monday morning after this weekend of protests? Because, that was the precipitative, element of her departure from government, wasn't it? The way that she approached the policing of the pro-Palestinian march this weekend that coincided with Armistice Day.
Yeah, so she's been very critical all week of the police, essentially suggesting that they should have banned the pro-Palestinian protest. The police said no because they didn't think there was enough intelligence to suggest that there's going to be a risk of serious disorder. Yeah. And I think Number 10 perhaps were just waiting to see what happened. They thought if they did sack her earlier on, then perhaps if there was lots of disorder, she would have been proven right and she would have been a bit of a martyr in that sense. But so I think that's the reason they left it till after the weekend. Has that worked? I'm not necessarily sure. It doesn't seem as if she was wrong. I was there on Saturday. It did descend into disorder. It was very chaotic. I mean, it must be said most of the march was completely peaceful, but then you had the far-right thugs who were basically there at the behest of Tommy Robinson, who's back. He's back on Twitter. He was back in central London again. And they were just trying to intercept the protest again and again and again. The police were trying to do a very difficult job of keeping them separate, and that sometimes didn't work and you did get violence. Right. So yeah, it was a very intense weekend, and I think that just spoke to where Suella Braverman is, and also she just tapped into something that's true. I mean, the other thing I think is worth noting is so many people have blamed the violence on Suella Braverman as if, anti-Muslim bigotry in this country or anger about immigration is only here because Suella Braverman made some comment in the papers the week before. No, of course, it's much more fundamental than that. It's been going on for a very long time. We saw a very similar pattern back in 2017 when you had the Al-Quds protest. Darren Osborne, who was the Finsbury Park mosque terrorist, he was supposedly inspired by Tommy Robinson back then. So this is a long-term problem you can't at all. I think it's easy. It's a Westminster way of looking at things just to go, it's Suella Braverman's fault. She's been inciting hatred. Well, okay, I think that's slightly short-term.
Okay, well, it's interesting because you said she's right. Let's get into this slightly because her big issue with this protest was on the pro-Palestinian side, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And she was suggesting that the police different marches differently, whether they're drawn from the left or the right. But as you saw over the weekend, the vast majority of arrests and people trying to make trouble were from the far right contingent. And of course, the police are investigating elements of anti-Semitism within the main march as well. So, in that sense, there was some hatred within that march as well. But you saw that the balance really wasn't tipped in what she was suggesting was going to be the problem over the weekend.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And you also saw that she didn't condemn the far-right thugs as explicitly as she did the pro-Palestinians after the march with her comments yesterday. Most of the violence and the arrests, as you say, Anoosh, were from the far right, but there were also elements of violence, anti-Semitism, hatred amongst the march. I remember speaking to one 25-year-old man at the end of the march. He and his mates were wearing balaclavas. They had their big German Shepherd on a chain. I was like, "How are you? What are you doing here?" And he just straight away went into a bit of a rant about how Israel created Hamas, how they were actually responsible for the massacre on October 7th.
So Israel were responsible?
They said it was the IDF. It's a conspiracy theory. The IDF are the ones who committed the massacre as a pretext to invade Gaza. So there were also these elements of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories. Now, that's not to say that it's representative of the whole march. There are hundreds of thousands of people there, and obviously I didn't speak to anyone, but there's been pockets of that. But it's you're definitely right to say most of the violence came from the far right.
Yeah, and whether or not that was directly a result of Suella Braverman's words or not, it basically cast what she'd been doing in the days before in a light of, okay, she's been too inflammatory. She's basically been she's got the wrong end of the stick on this, really.
I mean, I guess that's how people are portraying it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to find that causal link. There are some reports of people saying, well, we're here to prove that it's not a hate march. Yeah, okay, this has also been billed as the biggest march yet for quite a long time. So I don't think the two are necessarily causally related. But also, it just, as I said earlier, it neglects the fact that we need to look at the long-term issues here. Why is it that we've got the far right coming to London? Are we looking at the policing here? Are we looking at anti-Muslim bigotry? There was also lots of racist chants from them. So there are undercurrents that need analysing rather than just a Westminster debate about what the Home Secretary might have said as part of her political posturing for the leadership.
Yeah, and I do remember going to cover some of the sort of so-called UK Yellow Vests marches and things, and you did see this group of people come out for some of the Brexit marches to clash with the People's Vote marches. Some of the anti-lockdown is connected to some of these groups. So, you do get these groups of people coming to London to try and stir up trouble every time there's a different cause, whether they agree or not with it.
The Tommy Robinson Telegram account for the past 5 days has just been full of a combination of conspiracy theories, a combination of Elon Musk videos, a combination of Douglas Murray videos. Yeah. So there's a web of causes, I think, that amongst the far right always get connected. It's often related to online radicalization. It's often related to conspiracy theories, and these things express themselves in different ways.
Yes, and the whole sort of Westminster wisdom was Sunak hadn't sacked Braverman yet because she'd cause him more trouble on the backbenches. Yeah. How true is that? I mean, how much support does she really have?
Well, it's questionable. She's not got this large coterie of supporters that Rishi Sunak did actually have, because he was seen by many as a really extremely proficient politician. She doesn't have that as such. She does have lots of sympathetic MPs. You've seen some of the sort of classic people we'd expect on this side of things. Lee Anderson has expressed some support for her. I think Miriam Cates did as well last week. But I think it's really hard to tell. You've got to remember as well, in the past 6 weeks or so, not many MPs haven't spent much time in Westminster.
Yeah.
So there's not been that.
Because there is a recess while they do the King's Speech.
Yeah, which just keeps happening.
Yeah.
It feels like we've not been in Westminster at all for the past 6 weeks. We had conference season. Then we had the prorogation for the King's Speech. So that is the big question, I think. Can she corral that support within the party and cause some serious problems for Sunak?
And how fair is it? Because I agree with you. I think there's quite a lot in substance that's similar between what she was saying and what some more, maybe in more mild-mannered terms, some other ministers were saying. So, Rishi Sunak, Oliver Dowden, and then you had Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, who was seen as more sort of liberal MPs saying the same things basically about this march, not trusting the police to police it properly and saying it would be better if it didn't go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's very noticeable that people often or always talk about the tone of the Home Secretary rather than actually engaging with their arguments. I think one of the key differences, though, is that she is the Home Secretary, and the key problem was that she was supposedly or seeming to interfere with the operational independence of the Met Police, which is a very important thing. The politicians make laws, the police enforce them. That's one of the key aspects of rule of law, and that was one of the key reasons I think that it was so controversial.
Yeah, as if any Home Secretary hasn't tried to politicise the police before. So let's quickly talk about James Cleverly before moving on to Cameron. He is actually quite an experienced cabinet minister now. He's been around for a while in these big roles, Foreign Secretary. How do you think he'll fare at the Home Office? Because it is a basket case of a department, and like you say, that Rwanda ruling is coming up, which is going to be a very delicate matter.
Yeah, so he's going to be the person who is responsible for the migration issue all the way up, hopefully all the way up to the next election. It's going to be a massive role. It's also a shift away from foreign politics towards domestic politics. He's going to be in the limelight much more. He's going to be on the news much more. So I think an interesting question from the political perspective is this going to negatively affect James Cleverly's positioning for the top job? He was already running as the most popular cabinet minister according to Conhome's ratings amongst Tory members. Yeah. And we know that the Foreign Secretary is often in a good position to jump into the top job. We saw Boris Johnson do it in some form, and then Liz Truss did it as well. He can sort of claim responsibility for these big agreements with countries around the world. He also looked quite prime ministerial as you're travelling around, whereas the Home Secretary is a job where you're having constant debates, constant arguments, you're talking about very controversial things. So it will be interesting to see if he tries to calm down the rhetoric, adopt a new tone. It will be fascinating. And it has Rishi Sunak also potentially neutralise another leadership candidate in doing so.
Yeah, because if it were me, I wouldn't really want to be moved to the Home Secretary position because it is a bit of a...
You say no thanks.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a poison chalice, isn't it? Because like you say, being Foreign Secretary is really quite strangely not that much of a political job. You're not held to account on domestic issues like that are contentious and affecting people's lives day to day. But we'll see how he fares and whether or not he stays the most popular among Tory members. And how about this return of David Cameron? I mean, I really see the hand of William Hague here, because Hague is very influential on Sunak's decision-making and how Number 10 works, which you included in your piece about Inside Number 10. He obviously came back. I mean, he was never Prime Minister, but he was leader of the Conservatives and came back as Foreign Secretary and was deemed to have done quite a good job in that position. Is this the thinking, do you think, behind Cameron's appointment?
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable. It's a return to the past. It speaks, I think...
Return to the past. That's quite poetic, Freddie.
Thank you. In my beginning is my end, yeah. I think, I mean, it speaks to the cyclical cycle of Tory politics at the moment. I think it also speaks to the fact that Rishi Sunak, even if he does have these right-wing politics, is actually quite sympathetic to the more Cameroon liberal approach to the way of governing things, or the way of governance, the having that more collaborative, professional way of approaching things that doesn't necessarily always lean on the populism of Liz Truss or Boris Johnson, for instance. I think it demolishes actually his claims to be a change candidate. He has, as he did in his conference speech, condemned the politics of the past 30 years, and now he's brought in one of the architects of that consensus.
Yeah, it's quite ironic.
It also feels as if we've not done a good job, so let's go back to someone who's done it before. It feels like they're out of their depths and you have to go and call the prefect to come along and help them out. And the other thing I think is really interesting about Cameron's appointment is that he pursued a very collaborative diplomatic approach to China. We had the famous golden era that he and George Osborne pursued to try and get more Chinese investment into the UK. Since then, we've seen an absolute reversal of relations with the Chinese. Both the US, the UK, the EU have all recognised that China poses some national security threats, and they've acted accordingly. I think it's also an affirmation of Rishi Sunak's more liberal approach to China.
Yes, and James Cleverly's, actually.
Yeah. Which is in complete contrast to Liz Truss. So we've seen both at the Treasury and at Number 10, Rishi Sunak say that we need to ensure that we can still trade with China. He thinks that we should have cooperation on things like climate change, and I think that's an affirmation of this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because you will have those China skeptics in the Conservative Party who are, they're quite a weighty group of people. There's a lot of them who might be a little bit unsettled if Cameron returns to that attempt at a golden age with Britain's relationship with China. And then, of course, he is going to always be associated with the Prime Minister who either, Remainers blame for doing the EU referendum in the first place, and Brexiteers are unsettled by because he was on the Remain side of the argument. And while there might be sort of a bit of nostalgia, not just in the Conservative Party, actually, over Cameron, I mean, he has blotted his copybook quite spectacularly since he left office, hasn't he, with the Greensill lobbying scandal?
Yeah, so Cameron went in to lobby for Greensill. While he was actually cleared of breaking any lobbying rules, it was clear that his reputation was absolutely besmirched. He was seen to be lobbying on behalf of a private finance company, using his experience as Prime Minister to try and get some favours from inside government. That was the perception. So I think it does speak again to the desperation of Rishi Sunak, that he's reverted to someone who is known for lobbying for private companies.
Yeah, desperation is interesting because it does suggest that there's a dearth of figures on the sort of like One Nation side of the party, doesn't it? You could have got your Rory Stewarts or your Dominic Greaves to come in, but they've all gone.
Yeah, and also I wrote about this last week or so. I do think there's a strong argument to make that Rishi Sunak has given up on winning the next election. I think that's why you saw he was so excited, so focused on the AI summit, because that was a legacy project. It was not necessarily about winning votes and trying to fight back. It was about securing a legacy for himself once he leaves office, and maybe having someone come in with such experience, even if they're not going to be that politically helpful, says the same.
So he's been put in a Lords so that he can be in government. How does that actually work? Because we haven't had this situation where someone's held one of these great offices of state for a long time from the Lords. Obviously, we do have Lords ministers, but they're not high profile.
No, so you've got lots of Lord ministers. The Minister for Investment, for instance, is a Lord. I think he's called Lord Dominic, if I got that right. I can't remember his second name. But what happens is that they basically are held to account in the Lords as MPs who are ministers are held to account in the House of Commons. It's not as if they go to the House of Commons to answer ministers' questions, for instance. So I think you're going to have quite a strange situation where you've got the Foreign Secretary say there's a big international event like Gaza or whatever it is, and they have to go and answer questions. You're going to have David Cameron, Lord or Baron. I think he's actually got the barony of the United Kingdom, which is remarkable. He's going to be going into the House of Lords, so you're going to have that quite strange dynamic. So
it means, I think, an elevated role for the other ministers in the Foreign Office, because they're going to be the ones answering ministers' questions in the Commons. I imagine that they will be doing media quite a lot as well. And of course, when MPs are held to account, it is far more political in the Lords. The peers operate sometimes quite independently. They don't always vote along party lines. They're not as in hoc to their whips. So I do think that it's going to put a lot of pressure on that Foreign Office team.
Yeah, so you've got some senior figures. You've got Andrew Mitchell, for instance, who's a former chief whip and was a senior part of Cameron's government actually back in the day. So he was responsible for international development at the moment. You might also see him, as you say, Anoosh, playing a greater role in answering questions in the House of Commons. And do you think we'll finally hear Labour talk more about austerity, Anoosh?
Yeah, exactly.
Is this their opportunity?
This is a nightmare for them because they don't want to talk about austerity, do they? And now they've got this massive target in the middle of the cabinet. That will be a question. Let's see how they respond to it. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.